Good morning, this will just be a quick video on how I went about making this rustic style bar for my sister's wedding. These were going to be cut up for firewood next year, but I picked the nicest 4 with the most character for the bar. We had some leftover lengths of pine from some concrete formwork that I used for the main beams. I measured and marked all the legs to the same height and then cut them to length. You could do this with a circular saw or a chainsaw. If you were using a circular saw, you might have to rotate the log a couple of times as the saw depth might not be enough to go all the way through. And in this case, it still wasn't, so I just had to give the whole thing a bit of a tap with a hammer. That took longer than I would have liked, so time to move on to the chainsaw. All 4 legs are now the same length. Okay, time to do some marking out for the notches. What we are looking at here is the top of the front left-hand side post. I mark a straight line shy of halfway, mark the center of that line, grab your protractor and mark out 60 degrees. You should be left with something looking like this. We're going to be cutting out that 120 degree wedge. Draw a vertical line 100 mm down to act as a guide. Do the same for the other side of the wedge. And roughly sketch a horizontal line across, joining those 2 points up. My husband is far more skilled on the chainsaw than I am, so he volunteered to cut these chunks out for me. The front right-hand post is a mirror image of the one we just did, and the back posts are drawn up the same as the front, except we're going to be cutting out that 60 degree wedge opposed to the 120 degree wedge. My ruler is going to do some demonstrating here. This will be the right-hand side of the bar, the front of the bar, and the back. Now that all the wedges have been cut out from the top of the 4 posts, we now have to do the same thing to the bottom of all the posts. Here I'm just using a straight edge as a bit of a guide to make sure that the top wedge and the bottom wedge are aligned. And I'm just adjusting the line slightly to make sure that the degrees are the same as the top. I scraped as much of the dry concrete off of these lengths as I could, marked the 2 spots that I'm going to be drilling, pre-drill your holes larger than the shank of the screw, and give them a chamfer. I used a decking screw in reverse to score the post below it. Then with a drill bit smaller than the shank of the screw, I drill a pilot hole into the post to prevent any splitting. Do the same for the bottom as we did for the top until you have the front face of the bar all framed out. If you want your corrugated iron to slide in neatly into that post, you're going to have to cut a channel. Owen did this with the chainsaw. Only take off a little bit at a time and keep sliding that corrugated iron up against it to see where you need to take some more from. Try not to take too much off at once because you might regret it. Now that the corrugated iron fits, I move on to squaring up one end. Measure the height of the bar and use the angle grinder to cut that piece to length. I use a nail and a hammer to punch a hole through the corrugated iron so that the screws can easily go through into the timber behind it. My fingernails are getting awkwardly long, but I had to start growing them ready for the wedding. I attached the iron with cheap chipboard screws. We are now moving on to the sides of the bar. Here I am marking 2 parallel lines so I can pre-cut a channel for the corrugated iron. Set your circular saw to your ideal depth and just cut along both your lines. Pull out the scrap material and clean it up a little if need be. The sides of the bar are half the width of a corrugated iron sheet, so I cut that down the center using the cutting disc on the angle grinder. I'm leaving the sides alone for a bit and moving on to framing up the back. I cut the top and bottom beam to the same length, roughly mark the angle, set your circular saw accordingly, and cut away using your speed square to keep all your cuts straight. Now moving back to the sides, we have the corrugated iron tucked into those grooves that we pre-cut earlier. I found it easier to attach the corrugated iron first and then attach the frame afterwards. It helped push everything else out and make it a lot more secure. These angles were set to 35 degrees and again using the speed square to keep the cut straight. Well, it's really starting to come together, and before we put the top on, we are going to very awkwardly carry it across the paddock into position so we don't have to try and move it later on. For the bar top, I cut and pulled apart some pallets and ran the palings through the thicknesser, square up and attach the first paling. For the screw holes, I marked in 20mm either side, pre-drilled then chamfered. Square it up again before attaching. Do the same thing for the paling down the other end, and fill in the centre with as many loose palings as required. These will all be left oversized and we'll just cut them all at once to length at the end. If you are left with a gap that needs filling, chances are that one side of the gap is larger than the other. So take a measurement from either side and jot that down. Mark out those measurements on either end and use a straight edge to connect those together. Now that we have our line, clamp that piece to a sturdy bench like this one. Run the circular saw along that line. Flip it over, re-clamp it and finish the cut. Place that paling among the others. Grab a straight edge and quickly mark out all your screw holes. Use some tape as a depth gauge on your drill bit so you can drill your holes right where they are. Then go along and chamfer all the holes and attach them with chipboard screws. Now that it's all attached, it's time to cut the top to size. I start by measuring 135mm from the screws, connect the dots, clamp down a straight edge, and run the circular saw all the way along. I'm glad we moved it beforehand because I don't think this would have fitted out the gate otherwise. I ran some palings through the table saw set at 30mm, pre-drilled and chamfered the holes. These will be attached under the entire lip of the bar. Because of how much overhang there is, I didn't want any twisting or warping in the individual pieces, so this theoretically should stop that from happening. Gave the whole top a good sand, and it's done. If you like building with pallets or other cheaper materials, then you might want to check out some of my other videos. If you liked this video or found it somewhat helpful, then give me a thumbs up. If you didn't, you can give me a thumbs down if you like, but either way, I hope I see you next time.